The air in the North Atlantic doesn't just feel cold. It feels like a physical weight, a jagged blade of ice pressing against your lungs. On April 14, 1912, the sky was so clear it looked like a shroud of diamonds laid over a coffin. This was the night the world's greatest dream met the ocean's coldest reality. Imagine a city made of steel floating on a sea of ink. 11 stories of luxury, vibrating with the hum of massive engines. Men in tuxedos sipping brandy, women in silk gowns laughing, and in the dark corners of the lower decks, mothers clutching their children, praying for the sight of the Statue of Liberty. They all believed one thing: this ship cannot sink. But as the Titanic raced through the dark at 22 knots, a silent giant, 10,000 years in the making, was waiting. A mountain of ice, blacker than the night itself. Southampton, April 10. The scale of the RMS Titanic was impossible to grasp. Standing at the docks of Southampton, she looked like a mountain that had been conquered and turned into a machine. For John Jacob Astor IV, the ship was a statement of power. For Margaret Molly Brown, it was a journey home. But for Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, it was his child. Andrews walked the decks with a notebook, checking every rivet, every mahogany panel. He knew the ship was practically unsinkable, but in engineering, practically is a dangerous word. The crowds cheered as the massive whistles blew, a sound so deep it shook the teeth of everyone in the city. The Titanic moved, a leviathan waking up. As she pulled away, the suction was so powerful it nearly pulled another ship, the New York, into a collision. A bad omen, perhaps, but the wealthy on the upper decks laughed it off with champagne. The Titanic was a microcosm of the 20th century. The first class, it was the Gilded Age at its peak. The grand staircase, topped with a crystal dome, was the center of the world. Here, fortunes were discussed over 10-course meals. The third-class steerage. Down below, the air was thicker, smelling of fresh paint and hope. Here were the Jack Dawsons of the world, real people like the Rice family or the Dean family. They weren't there for the luxury. They were there for the 3,000 miles of ocean that stood between them and a fresh start in America. The role of the Marconi wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. The ignored warnings from the Mesaba and the Californian asterisk. The psychological atmosphere, why Captain Smith didn't slow down. The perspective of Frederick Fleet in the crow's nest. The physics of the sideswipe, why a head-on collision might have saved the ship. The initial reaction, most passengers didn't feel a thing, just a shudder. Thomas Andrews, grim calculation in the chart room. The realization that 2,224 people cannot fit into 1,178 lifeboat seats. The first SOS signals sent into the void. The chaos at the lifeboats. The story of the Strauss couple, Macy's owners, who chose to stay together. The class struggle, why the third class was kept behind gates. The heroism of the 8 musicians who played until the water reached their feet. The Black Gang, engineers and firemen who stayed below to keep the lights on so others could escape. The ship breaking in two, the terrifying physics of the stern rising into the air. The silence after the sinking, and then the chorus of cries in the water. Captain Rostron's heroic dash through the ice to save the 705 survivors. The arrival in New York, a city in mourning. How the Titanic changed maritime law forever. The discovery of the wreck in 1985. Conclusion. Why we are still obsessed with the Titanic 114 years later. While the wealthy elite in the first-class lounge discussed the stock market and the immigrants in steerage danced to fiddles, a different kind of drama was unfolding in a cramped, humid room behind the bridge. This was the Marconi wireless room. In 1912, wireless telegraphy was the high-tech wonder of the age. It was the internet of the sea. 2 young men, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked in exhausting shifts, their ears pressed against heavy headphones, listening to the crackle and hiss of the atmosphere, To the world, the Titanic was a marvel of steel. To Phillips and Bride, she was a giant antenna. But there was a problem. The wireless set wasn't just for safety, it was a luxury service for the rich. Throughout April 14th, the Marconi boys were swamped. Wealthy passengers were sending hundreds of Marconigrams to friends in New York and London, dinner invitations, stock tips, and simple greetings like having a wonderful time on the unsinkable giant. The airwaves were jammed, and in the middle of this social chatter, the ocean began to speak. The North Atlantic was unusually busy with ice that year. A mild winter had caused more icebergs than usual to break off from Greenland and float south into the shipping lanes. 9:00 a.m. The asterisk Caronia sends a message: bergs, growlers, and field ice. Captain Smith acknowledges it. 1:42 p.m. The Baltic reports icebergs and large quantities of field ice. Asterisk 1:45 p.m. Asterisk the America warns of a large iceberg. 7:30 p.m. The Californian, a ship very close by, sends a specific coordinate of 3 large bergs. These weren't just suggestions. They were a map of a minefield. Captain Smith, a veteran of the seas known as the Millionaire's Captain, looked at the reports. He was under immense pressure from J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, to arrive in New York ahead of schedule. To slow down was to admit the ocean was stronger than the Titanic. Smith altered the ship's course slightly to the south, thinking he would go around the ice. He didn't slow the engines. He believed that in a clear, starlit night, any iceberg would be seen from miles away. At 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba sent a vital message. It described a massive, rectangular ice field directly in the Titanic's path. This was the most dangerous warning yet. But Jack Phillips was exhausted. The wireless set had broken down earlier that day, and he had spent hours fixing it. He was now frantically catching up on the backlog of passengers' private messages. When the Mesaba asterisk warning came in, he was busy sending a message for a wealthy passenger to a station in Cape Race, Newfoundland. He took the Mesaba asterisk note, but he didn't hand it to the bridge. He put a paperweight over it and continued typing. He was a victim of the customer service culture of the era, prioritizing the luxury of the elite over the safety of the hull. "Shut up, I am working." At 11:00 p.m., a final warning came. It was from the SS Californian asterisk, which was so close that its signal nearly deafened Jack Phillips in his headphones. The Californian's operator, Cyril Evans, signaled, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." Phillips, annoyed by the interruption and the volume of the signal, snapped back, "Shut up, shut up, I am working Cape Race." Evans, insulted and tired, turned off his wireless set and went to bed. For the next hour, the Titanic was effectively deaf. She was screaming through the dark at 45 miles per hour toward a wall of ice that she had been warned about 6 times, with her only nearby neighbor now asleep in the dark. On the bridge, the mood was eerily calm. Second Officer Lidler had noted the drop in temperature. It was now below freezing. He had told the lookouts to keep a sharp lookout for ice, particularly small ice and growlers. But there was a fatal flaw in their vision. The sea was flat calm. No wind, no waves. Normally, waves hit the base of an iceberg and create a white phosphorescent glow, a warning ring. Without waves, an iceberg would remain a dark, invisible silhouette until it was only a few hundred yards away. Inside the first-class smoking room, men were playing bridge. The laughter was loud. The chandeliers vibrated gently with the power of the 29 boilers. They were in the safest place on Earth, or so they thought. Against the stars, a ghost ship of light moving into a graveyard of ice. The bridge is silent. The wireless is quiet. The lookouts are straining their eyes. High above the deck, in the crow's nest, attached to the forward mast, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were shivering. The temperature had plummeted, and the air felt like needles against their skin. They had been at their post for nearly 2 hours, staring into a horizon that seemed to have no end. There was a cruel irony at play. The lookouts didn't have binoculars. They had been misplaced in Southampton when the ship's officers were reshuffled. Fleet and Lee were relying entirely on their naked eyes to spot danger in a sea that was flat calm, a sea that refused to break against the base of an iceberg and give away its position. The time was 11:39 p.m. Out of the haze, a dark shape began to materialize. It wasn't white like the postcards. It was a black berg, a mass of ice that had recently capsized, revealing its dark, water-soaked underside. It looked like a hole in the stars. Fleet's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the rope for the warning bell and struck it 3, clang, signal for an object directly ahead. He picked up the telephone to the bridge. "Is anyone there?" Fleet shouted. "Yes," Sixth Officer Moody replied calmly. "What do you see?" "Iceberg right ahead." "Thank you," Moody replied with a chilling professional politeness. On the bridge, First Officer William had only seconds to act. He had 2 choices: hit the iceberg head-on or try to steer around it. A head-on collision would have crushed the bow and killed dozens of crew members, but the Titanic likely would have stayed afloat. But acting on instinct and training, chose to avoid the collision. "Hard at starboard," he shouted to the helmsman Robert. Simultaneously, he rushed to the engine telegraphs and slammed them to full astern. He wanted to swing the bow away and use the engines to break the 46,000-ton monster. The Titanic began to groan. Slowly, too slowly, the bow began to veer to the left. For a few heart-stopping seconds, it looked like they might make it. The massive wall of ice glided past the bow, but then came the sound. It wasn't a loud crash. It was a faint, grinding jar. Below the waterline, the iceberg wasn't a smooth wall. It had a jagged, underwater spur that acted like a giant can opener. As the ship moved forward, the ice sliced through the steel plates of the hull, popping rivets like buttons on a shirt. In the first-class dining saloon, the crystal chandeliers rattled. A few passengers looked up from their card games, joked about a dropped plate in the kitchen, and went back to their drinks. But deep in the bowels of the ship, in boiler room number 6, the experience was different. A wall of green seawater and ice chunks exploded through the side of the ship. The firemen screamed as the cold Atlantic rushed in, dousing the furnaces and creating clouds of blinding steam. Captain Smith, who had been in his cabin, rushed to the bridge. "What have we hit?" "An iceberg, sir," replied, his face pale. Minutes later, Thomas, the ship's builder, arrived. They descended into the lower decks with a lamp. They saw the mail room flooding, the bags of letters floating in the dark. They saw the water rising in the steerage corridors. Opened a blueprint on the table. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with of her 16 watertight compartments flooded, but the iceberg had sliced through. "How long?" Smith asked. Looked at his watch. His voice was steady, but his eyes were vacant. "An hour and a half, possibly 2, not much longer." Despite the death warrant, the ship felt strangely normal. The lights were bright. The heaters were on. Most passengers didn't even know the ship had stopped. On the deck, a few passengers found chunks of ice that had fallen from the berg. They began a playful game of soccer, kicking the ice across the wooden planks. They were laughing on the deck of a dying ship, unaware that beneath their feet, the Atlantic was claiming the Titanic, 1 gallon at a time. Summary of the collision. Dead in the water. The silence is more terrifying than the noise. The engines have stopped, and the only sound is the hiss of steam escaping the funnels, sounding like a giant creature gasping for air. The Titanic was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, but it was also a victim of a lethal math problem. As Captain Smith and Thomas stood in the quiet chart room, the reality was stark. The ship carried people, the total capacity of the lifeboats. Even if every single boat was filled to its absolute limit, Over 1,000 people were destined to go down with the ship. Captain Smith, a man who had spent 40 years at sea, suddenly looked his age. He realized that the unsinkable reputation had led to a fatal arrogance. Under the British Board of Trade Regulations of 1894, a ship's lifeboat capacity was based on its, not the number of passengers. The Titanic was actually legal in its lifeboat count, but in the face of the Atlantic, legality meant nothing. At AM, the order was given. Uncover the boats, get the women and children ready. The crew moved with a sense of forced calm. Many of them had never even had a lifeboat drill. They struggled with the heavy canvas covers and the complicated ropes known as davits. On the decks, the atmosphere was surreal. The ship's band, led by, had moved from the warm lounge to the cold air of the boat deck. They began to play cheerful ragtime tunes. It was a psychological tactic, music to mask the sound of rising water and falling hopes. The order was simple, but its execution was brutal. On the Titanic, the rule was interpreted differently on each side of the ship. On the second officer, Charles took the order literally. Women and children. He would rather lower a boat half empty than allow a man to board. On the starboard side, officer was more flexible, allowing men to board if there were no women waiting. This inconsistency meant that your survival depended entirely on which side of the deck you stood. The first boat, lifeboat number, was lowered at AM. It had a capacity of 65 people. It left with only 28. Why? Because the passengers didn't want to leave. The Titanic was brightly lit, warm and massive. The lifeboats were small, frail, and dropping 60 feet down into a pitch-black, freezing void. To many, staying on the big ship felt safer than jumping into a tiny wooden box. While the first class was being escorted to the boats with polite whispers, a much darker scene was unfolding below. The third-class steerage passengers were trapped in a maze. The ship was designed with physical barriers, iron gates and locked doors, to comply with U.S. immigration laws that required steerage to be kept separate to prevent the spread of disease. As the water rose, many of these gates remained locked. Families from Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia found themselves in a drowning labyrinth. They didn't speak English, they didn't know the way to the top deck, and they didn't know that the boats were already leaving without them. One young passenger, Daniel, later described how he and a group of men had to break through a locked gate just to reach the stairs. For many in third class, the American dream was ending in a flooded hallway, miles from the open air. Captain Smith ordered the firing of distress rockets. Every few minutes, a blinding white flare would hiss into the sky and explode in a shower of sparks. Normally, these flares would signal for help to any ship nearby. Only 10 miles away, the lights of another ship, the SS, be seen on the horizon. The officers on the Californian saw the flares. They even told their captain, Stanley Lord. But Captain Lord, having turned off his wireless and settled in for the night, dismissed them as company signals or celebration fireworks. He went back to sleep, while 10 miles away, the greatest ship in the world screamed for help with silent white fire. Chapter 5 ends with the ship developing a noticeable list or tilt to the front. The water has reached the name on the bow. The denial is over. The panic is starting to brew under the surface of the polite Victorian manners. As the clock ticked past AM, the illusion of safety had vanished. The deck was now slanted at a precarious angle, and the roar of the water rushing into the lower hulls could be heard echoing up the elevator shafts. In this moment of ultimate crisis, the true character of the passengers was revealed. Benjamin, one of the wealthiest men on board, realized he would not be getting into a lifeboat. Instead of panicking, he went down to his cabin with his valet and changed into his finest evening wear, white tie and tails. When he returned to the deck, he famously told a crew member, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like." He spent his final hour helping women and children into boats, standing calm as the freezing spray hit his face. Perhaps the most enduring story of the Titanic is that of and Ida, the owners of department store. When the couple reached lifeboat number 8, the officer in charge offered a seat because of his age and status. Shook his head. "I will not go before the other men." He urged his wife Ida to get in. She stepped toward the boat, then paused. She looked at the man she had been married to for 40 years, the man who had walked beside her through every joy and sorrow. She stepped back onto the sinking deck and took his hand. "We have lived together for many years," she said softly. "Where you go, I go." She gave her fur coat to her maid, Ellen Bird, and pushed her into the lifeboat. The last time anyone saw the Strawses, they were sitting together on a pair of deck chairs, holding hands as a massive wave swept over the side of the ship. On the other side of the deck, Margaret Molly Brown was a force of nature, a daughter of Irish immigrants who had struck it rich in the silver mines of Colorado. She didn't have the refined silence of the New York elite. She was loud, she was tough, and she refused to die. Molly was eventually dropped into lifeboat number 6. Once on the water, she realized the boat was half empty, and the crewman in charge was paralyzed by fear. Molly took charge. She grabbed an oar, ordered the other women to start rowing to keep warm, and cursed out anyone who suggested they give up. She became the unsinkable Molly Brown, a symbol of American grit that refused to be swallowed by the Atlantic. Through all this, the screams, the creaking of the steel, the hissing of the steam, the music never stopped. Wallace Hartley Asterisk and his 7 bandmates stood on the boat deck, their fingers numb from the sub-zero air. They weren't playing for money or for fame. They were playing to keep the soul of the ship alive. As the water reached the bridge, they reportedly switched from upbeat ragtime to a solemn hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." None of the musicians survived. They stayed at their posts until the very end, proving that even in the face of death, art and humanity can hold back the darkness. While the drama unfolded on the decks, a silent sacrifice was happening miles below. The Black Gang, the engineers and firemen, remained in the sweltering, flooding engine rooms. They knew they were in a death trap, but they also knew that if the boilers exploded or the electricity failed, the lights would go out, the wireless would die, and the panic on deck would become a massacre. They stayed until the last possible second, keeping the Titanic's lights burning bright against the black ocean. Because of them, the ship remained a beacon of hope until the moment it broke apart. By 2:00 a.m., the Titanic was no longer a ship. She was a vertical ruin. The bow had dipped so far into the Atlantic that the massive bronze propellers, each the size of a house, were rising out of the water, glistening under the starlight. The weight of the water inside the forward compartments, estimated at over 30,000 tons, was pulling the front of the ship down, while the air-filled stern was being forced upward by sheer buoyancy. The stress on the ship's spine was unimaginable. The Titanic was never designed to be held in the air by her middle. On the decks, the physics of life had shifted. People could no longer walk. They had to crawl, clinging to railings, benches, and the brass fittings of the ship to avoid sliding down the increasingly steep incline toward the flooded bow. Inside the ship, the sound was deafening. It wasn't just the rushing water. It was the sound of everything that wasn't bolted down: grand pianos, thousands of pieces of china, heavy oak furniture, and massive boilers, breaking loose and crashing forward through the bulkheads. In the engine room, the Black Gang finally lost their battle. At 2:15 a.m., the ship's electrical generators, which had stayed dry through a miracle of engineering, finally succumbed to the flood. The brilliant white lights of the Titanic, which had provided a false sense of security for hours, suddenly flickered, turned a dull, sickly red, and then vanished. The world went pitch black. The only light came from the cold, indifferent stars and the tiny lanterns on the distant lifeboats. Suddenly, a sound like 1,000 claps of thunder ripped through the night. This was the sound of steel reaching its breaking point. Between the third and fourth funnels, the Titanic's hull began to tear. The unsinkable steel girders snapped like toothpicks. The ship groaned in a metallic scream that could be heard for miles across the water. Because the bow was so heavy with water and the stern was so high in the air, the ship literally snapped in two. The forward half, the bow, began its long, silent glide to the bottom of the ocean. The stern, now detached, momentarily settled back into the water, giving the hundreds of people clinging to it a brief, cruel hope that it might float. But the hope was short-lived. The open end of the stern was now exposed to the sea, and water rushed in with the force of a waterfall. At 2:18 a.m., the stern began its final rise. It stood perfectly vertical, a black tower silhouetted against the Milky Way. For 2 long minutes it stayed there, swaying slightly. People were falling from the heights, hitting the water or the machinery below with sickening thuds. Then, at 2:20 a.m., the stern began to slide backward. It moved slowly at first, then faster, as the air was forced out of the compartments in a series of muffled explosions. The surface of the water swirled into a giant vortex, swallowing the last of the Grand Hotel of the North Atlantic. The bubbles cleared, the whirlpool stopped, the Titanic was gone. What followed was the most haunting part of the tragedy, a sound that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. It wasn't silence. It was the sound of 1,500 people struggling in 28-degree water. In the freezing darkness, the chorus rose, a collective cry for help, for mothers, for God. To those in the lifeboats only a few hundred yards away, the sound was described as 1,000 bees humming or the roar of a distant stadium. The water of the North Atlantic is so cold that it doesn't just chill the skin, it strikes the heart like a hammer. Within minutes, the cries began to fade. The chorus thinned out as hypothermia took hold, turning the voices into whispers, and then finally into the most terrifying sound of all, absolute dead silence. After the Titanic vanished, the North Atlantic became an alien world. The 705 people in the lifeboats were scattered across miles of dark water. Some boats were overcrowded, sitting so low in the water that the freezing waves lapped over the sides. Others, like lifeboat number 1, were nearly empty, carrying only 12 people in a vessel designed for 40. The sound of the chorus, the cries of those in the water, had died down within 20 minutes. What was left was a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. There was no wind, no waves, just the creak of wooden oars and the sound of survivors sobbing quietly. In lifeboat number 6, Molly Brown refused to let the silence take over. She realized that if the women stopped rowing, they would freeze to death. She organized them, making them pull the oars in rhythm to keep their blood moving. She argued with Quartermaster Hitchens, who was convinced they were all going to die. "Look at the stars," she reportedly shouted. "We are alive and we are going to stay that way." The nightmare on Collapsible B. Not everyone was in a sturdy wooden boat. Charles Lytler, the second officer, found himself clinging to Collapsible B, a lifeboat that had floated off the deck upside down. Nearly 30 men were balanced on the slippery, overturned bottom of the boat. They stood back to back, shifting their weight in unison to keep the boat from flipping over every time a swell hit them. They were standing knee-deep in the freezing Atlantic, their legs going numb, their bodies shaking with uncontrollable tremors. Among them was Harold Bride, junior wireless operator. His feet were crushed and frozen, but he stayed upright. These men spent the night in a state of prayer and quiet desperation, watching the horizon for a light that refused to appear. Unknown to the survivors, help was coming at a suicidal speed. 58 miles away, the RMS Carpathia ** had picked up the Titanic's SOS. Its captain, Arthur Rostron **, was a man of action. The moment he heard the news, he turned his ship around. He ordered his engineers to turn off the heat and hot water in the passenger cabins so that every ounce of steam could be diverted to the engines. The Carpathia, a ship with a top speed of 14 knots, began pushing 17 knots. It was racing through the same ice field that had killed the Titanic, dodging bergs in the dark without sonar. Rostron had his crew prepare hot coffee, blankets, and soup. He turned the ship's dining halls into makeshift hospitals. He was a man on a mission to beat death. Around 3:30 a.m., the survivors saw a flash on the horizon. It wasn't a star. It was a green flare fired by the Carpathia. A wave of emotion swept through the lifeboats. People who had been silent for hours began to cheer, though their voices were cracked and weak. As the sun began to rise at 4:00 a.m., the true scale of the tragedy was revealed by the light. The ocean was no longer just black water. It was a field of white. Icebergs, some hundreds of feet high, surrounded them like silent sentinels. And floating among them were the remains of the world's most luxurious ship. White lifebelts, wooden deck chairs, and the tragic, frozen figures of those who hadn't made it to the boats. One by one, the lifeboats pulled alongside the Carpathia asterisk. The survivors were hauled up by ropes and slings. Many were so frozen they couldn't move their limbs. As they stepped onto the deck of the rescue ship, the first thing they asked was, "Is my husband here? Is my mother safe?" For the vast majority, the answer was silence. Out of the many families who had boarded the Titanic together, only fragments remained. The American dream had been cut in half. The Carpathia stayed in the area for several hours, searching for more survivors, but they found only empty boats and a sea of white. At 8:50 a.m., Captain Rostron headed for New York, carrying 705 shadows of the 2,224 souls who had started the journey. While the Carpathia steamed toward New York in a heavy, mournful silence, the rest of the world was in a state of chaotic confusion. In 1912, news traveled by wire, and the wires were tangled. In the first 24 hours after the sinking, American newspapers were desperate for headlines. Because the Titanic was unsinkable, early reports were wildly optimistic. One headline in the Virginia Pilot read, "All Titanic passengers are safe, gigantic liner in tow." Crowds gathered outside the White Star Line offices on Broadway, clinging to the hope that the ship was merely damaged and being pulled to port. But as the days passed, the silence from the Atlantic became deafening. Families of the wealthy and the poor alike stood side by side in the rain, waiting for any scrap of information. When the wireless signals finally cleared, the grim truth hit like a tidal wave. The Titanic was gone. More than 1,500 people were missing. On the evening of April 18, 1912, the Carpathia entered New York Harbor. It was a dark, rainy night. As the ship passed the Statue of Liberty, thousands of people lined the piers. There was no cheering. The only sound was the low, mournful whistle of the ship and the distant tolling of church bells. The Carpathia did something symbolic first. She stopped at the White Star Line's Pier 59 and dropped off the empty Titanic lifeboats. These small, wooden shells were all that remained of the world's greatest ship. Then, she moved to Pier 54 to let the survivors off. 30,000 people surged against the police barricades. When the survivors began to walk down the gangplank, the reality of the tragedy became visible. Women walked off in mismatched clothes, wrapped in ship blankets, their eyes hollow and vacant. Some were carrying infants. Many were looking over their shoulders, waiting for husbands who would never appear. The tragedy was a great equalizer. J.J. Astor's pregnant wife, Madeline, was whisked away in a private limousine, a widow at 18. At the same time, young Irish and Italian women from the steerage decks were led to local shelters and hospitals, having lost everything: their families, their money, and their belongings. For the American public, the loss of men like Astor and Guggenheim was a shock to the system. It was the end of an era of perceived invincibility. If the richest men in the world couldn't buy their way off a sinking ship, then no one was safe. The grief quickly turned to anger. Before the survivors could even find a night's sleep, the U.S. Senate launched an inquiry at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The American public demanded answers. Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why did the Californian watch the flares and do nothing? Why was the ship racing through ice at full speed? J. Bruce Ismay, the director of the White Star Line who had managed to get into a lifeboat, became the most hated man in America. The press labeled him J. Brute Ismay and the coward of the Titanic. The American audience, known for its sense of justice and fair play, could not forgive a leader who survived while his passengers and crew went down with the ship. Across the United States, flags were flown at half-mast. In Washington, D.C., President William Howard Taft mourned his friend and military aide, Major Archibald Butt, who had perished on the ship. Memorial services were held in every major city. The tragedy had bridged the gap between the classes, at least for a moment. The American dream had been scarred, but the stories of heroism, of the men who stayed behind so others could live, became the new foundation of the Titanic legend. The Titanic did not just sink a ship, it sank an entire era of human arrogance. Before April 15, 1912, the Western world believed that technology had finally conquered nature. After that night, that confidence was shattered. The tragedy forced the world to change its laws. Because of the Titanic, the *** International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was created. It became a global law that every ship must have enough lifeboats for every soul on board. It led to the creation of the ** International Ice Patrol **, which monitors icebergs to this day, ensuring that no other captain is ever blind in the dark. The wireless radio, once a toy for the rich, became a mandatory safety tool, manned 24 hours a day on every vessel. The ghost on the ocean floor. For 73 years, the Titanic rested in total darkness, 2.5 miles down. Many thought she was gone forever, her exact location a mystery. But the legend never died. It lived on in books, in the memories of the aging survivors, and in the hearts of explorers. In 1985, an American oceanographer named Dr. Robert Ballard ** led a joint French-American expedition. Using a deep-sea robot named *Argo, he searched the seabed. At 1:00 a.m. on September 1st, nearly the same time the ship began its final struggle decades earlier, a grainy image appeared on the monitor. It was a giant boiler. Then, the hull. The world gasped as the first photos reached the surface. The Titanic was there, split in two, surrounded by a debris field that looked like a frozen museum. There were leather shoes, suitcases, and even unopened bottles of champagne, silent witnesses to the lives that had ended there. Why is the USA still obsessed with this story? Perhaps it is because the Titanic is the ultimate American drama. It is a story about the American dream interrupted. It is a story about class, about the struggle between the haves and the have-nots, and about the raw, unfiltered courage of individuals who chose to die so that others might live. From the 1953 classic film to James Cameron's 1997 blockbuster, the Titanic has been retold 1,000 times. Each generation finds something new in it. In the 20th century, it was a warning about technology. In the 21st century, it is a reminder of our shared humanity. As of 2026, the Titanic is slowly disappearing. Deep-sea bacteria are eating the iron, and the grand staircase and the captain's cabin are collapsing into rust. Scientists estimate that in a few decades, the ship will be nothing more than a brown stain on the ocean floor. But while the steel may vanish, the story never will. The names of the 1,500 who perished are etched into history. The lessons learned in that freezing water are taught in every maritime school in the world. The Titanic remains a ghost ship that sails through our collective memory, a reminder that we are all, in a sense, passengers on a fragile vessel in a vast, unpredictable ocean. It teaches us that While we cannot always control the icebergs in our path, we can control how we treat one another when the lights go out. To the creators and storytellers of today, the Titanic isn't just a historical event. It is a canvas of human emotion. Whether you are making a video, writing a book, or sharing a post, remember that behind every statistic is a person who had a dream, a family, and a future. That is why, 114 years later, we still stop and listen when we hear the name. The Iron Leviathan, the night the dream sank. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe to Heroism and turn on notifications. Your likes and comments help the channel grow, so let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Smiling face with smiling eyes.